The Mafia's story begins not with gunfire in the streets, but with silence in the Sicilian countryside. In the early 1800s, Sicily was a land scarred by centuries of foreign rule, poverty, and mistrust of authority. The old feudal system had collapsed, yet the new Italian state was fragile and distant. Justice and protection were scarce. Out of this void, men of influence rose from the villages. Men who could promise safety, settle disputes, and enforce their will when the law could not. These were the roots of the Mafia. At the heart of Sicily's transformation was a booming citrus trade. Oranges and lemons, once rare luxuries, became Europe's prized export. So valuable they were called liquid gold. With riches came risk. Thieves targeted shipments, rival families fought for land, and absentee landlords were helpless to protect their estates. To safeguard their wealth, landowners hired armed guards. But soon, those guards discovered that fear was more profitable than loyalty. They evolved into secret brotherhoods, laying the foundations of what would later be called Cosa Nostra. Central to this rising power was omerta, the code of silence. It was more than a rule. It was a way of life. To break it meant death. Under omerta, disputes were settled not in courts, but in backrooms and fields. Protection payments replaced taxes, and justice was swift, brutal, and final. For the powerless farmer or merchant, obeying the Mafia wasn't collaboration. It was survival. Fear became currency, and silence became law. By the mid-19th century, the Mafia was no longer just a loose network of protectors. It had grown into a shadow power, one that thrived in the absence of state authority. It was born in the countryside but would soon dominate the cities. Sicily had given birth to something unique, not just a criminal gang, but an institution, a system of power built on fear, silence, and blood. A force that governments would try and fail to erase. When Italy unified in 1861, many celebrated the birth of a modern nation. But in Sicily, the new government was a distant voice carried by the wind. Corruption ran deep, officials were easily bribed, and justice rarely reached the island's villages. The Mafia saw opportunity. They became the hidden rulers of Sicily, offering the kind of order the state could not. To the locals, they were protectors. To the politicians, they were useful allies. To their enemies, they were executioners. The new Italian state struggled to collect taxes, enforce laws, or even keep peace. Politicians quickly discovered that the Mafia could deliver votes and silence dissent. In return, the Mafia was allowed to thrive. It infiltrated law enforcement, the courts, and local governments. What was once a band of rural enforcers was becoming Cosa Nostra, our thing, a brotherhood bound by secrecy, blood oaths, and a promise of mutual protection. But Cosa Nostra did not only deal in politics. They expanded their influence into land, agriculture, and trade. Every citrus shipment, every wheat harvest, every contract passed through their hands. They collected protection money from peasants, merchants, and aristocrats alike. Resistance was rare, because those who defied them often disappeared. The state's weakness had become the Mafia's strength. Sicily was now under two governments, one in Rome and another in the shadows. By the end of the century, the Mafia was no longer just a Sicilian phenomenon. It was a power structure that reached across Italy and even abroad. Emigration to America carried Mafia traditions to New York and New Orleans, where Italian immigrants brought both their dreams and their shadow brotherhoods. What began as local protectors had become an international force. The world would soon learn the name Cosa Nostra. By the 1920s, the Mafia had become a shadow government in Sicily, controlling trade, land, and politics. But a new power was rising in Italy, Benito Mussolini's fascist regime. Mussolini despised the Mafia, not only for their crimes, but because they challenged his vision of absolute authority. In his eyes, there could be only one power in Italy, the fascist state. And so, he declared war on Cosa Nostra. To lead the campaign, Mussolini appointed Cesare Mori, known as the Iron Prefect. Mori waged an all-out assault on the Mafia, with ruthless efficiency. Villages were surrounded by armed police, homes raided, suspects dragged into the streets. Mori understood that fear was the Mafia's greatest weapon, so he used it against them. He arrested thousands, tortured suspects, and paraded Mafia bosses in public trials to humiliate them. For the first time in history, the Mafia was on the defensive. For a moment, it seemed Mussolini had succeeded. Mafia families fled underground, and their grip on Sicilian society loosened. But the victory was not as complete as the fascists claimed. Mori's crackdown was brutal, but it could not destroy the Mafia's roots, its deep ties to land, family, and silence. Cosa Nostra waited in the shadows, weakened but not defeated, biding its time for the moment the regime would fall. That moment came with the Second World War. In 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily. The fascist regime collapsed, and with it, the Iron Prefect's control. The Mafia saw its chance to rise again. In the ruins of Mussolini's dictatorship, the old men of honor stepped back into the light, ready to reclaim their empire. In July 1943, the Allies launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. It was one of the largest amphibious assaults of the war. The beaches erupted with gunfire, tanks, and paratroopers. But for the Allied commanders, conquering Sicily was not just about defeating German and Italian forces. It was about controlling the island, a land where loyalty was fragile and resistance was strong. To win, they needed local allies. That's when the Mafia stepped forward. Many Mafia leaders had been imprisoned under Mussolini's fascist regime. Now, with the fascists collapsing, the Americans saw an opportunity. Figures like Lucky Luciano, the notorious New York Mafia boss with Sicilian roots, were approached by U.S. intelligence. From his prison cell, Luciano promised to mobilize Sicilian contacts to aid the Allied advance. In return, he secured his freedom and restored the Mafia's bridge between Italy and America. As Allied troops advanced inland, Mafia bosses were released from prisons and installed as mayors of Sicilian towns. Men like Calogero Vizzini, once considered simple criminals, now became respected local leaders under American approval. For the villagers, the Mafia had returned, stronger than ever, wearing a cloak of legitimacy. The fascists had tried to bury them, but the war had resurrected them. The alliance between the Mafia and the Allies was never written in official records, but its consequences were undeniable. With American backing, the Mafia regained influence over politics, trade, and land. What Mussolini had nearly destroyed, the Second World War had revived. Sicily once again belonged to Cosa Nostra, and from these war years, the Mafia would begin its transformation into a global criminal empire. The war was over. Sicily was free, but its freedom came at a cost. With American support, the Mafia had risen from the shadows and now sought new opportunities. Italy in the 1950s was rebuilding, modernizing, and expanding. The Mafia understood something critical: chaos breeds profit. And in this period of growth, the Mafia became richer and more powerful than ever before. One of the Mafia's first moves was to seize control of construction and real estate. Palermo, once filled with historic villas and gardens, was transformed almost overnight. This period became known as the Sack of Palermo. Mafia-backed companies demolished centuries-old architecture to make room for endless rows of cheap apartment blocks. Politicians granted building permits to Mafia front men, while Cosa Nostra pocketed millions. For ordinary Sicilians, it was the destruction of their heritage. For the Mafia, it was the birth of an empire built on concrete. But construction was only the beginning. By the 1960s, the Mafia had discovered the most lucrative business of all: heroin trafficking. With contacts in the United States through figures like Lucky Luciano, the Sicilian Mafia became central players in the global drug trade. Laboratories hidden in Sicilian farmhouses refined morphine into heroin, which was shipped across the Atlantic. The profits were astronomical. For every kilogram sold in America, Cosa Nostra multiplied its wealth tenfold. Yet this golden age was also marked by blood. Rival families fought over drug routes and construction profits. The violence culminated in the First Mafia War, 1962 to 1963. Bombings and assassinations shook Palermo. The Italian state responded with the Sicily massacre investigation, after a car bomb killed 7 policemen and soldiers. For the first time, the Mafia's existence was acknowledged as a national threat, but despite arrests, Cosa Nostra endured. By the 1970s, the Mafia was no longer just a Sicilian brotherhood. It was a transnational criminal empire, with roots in politics, construction, and narcotics. They had money, guns, and influence, stretching from Palermo to New York. But the seeds of their downfall were also being planted. Ambition was turning into greed, and violence was spiraling out of control. The Mafia's golden age would soon give way to its darkest chapter. By the 1980s, the Sicilian Mafia was at the height of its power. It controlled billions in drug profits, politicians feared it, and businessmen obeyed it. But beneath the surface, the organization was tearing itself apart. Greed and ambition created divisions, and one man in particular, Toto Riina, the brutal leader of the Corleone clan, unleashed a reign of terror that would change Italy forever. The Corleone rose by eliminating rivals. Dozens of mafia bosses were executed in the Second Mafia War, early 1980s. Unlike previous generations, Riina didn't care about subtlety. He believed fear was the ultimate weapon. Bombings, public assassinations, and massacres spread across Sicily. Even mafia tradition was broken. Bosses who once enjoyed immunity were slaughtered, their families targeted. Palermo became a battlefield. But the violence could not stay hidden. In 1982, the assassination of General Carlo Alberto Dalla Chiesa, a national hero sent to fight the Mafia, shocked Italy. His murder marked the beginning of public outrage. Politicians could no longer ignore the Mafia's shadow. For the first time, civil society began openly resisting Cosa Nostra, demanding justice. The state finally struck back with unprecedented force. In 1986, the Maxi trial began in Palermo. Thanks to testimonies from mafia defectors like Tommaso Buscetta, prosecutors Giovanni Falcone, and Paolo Borsellino charged 475 mafiosi. It was the largest trial in Italian history. For the first time, the Mafia was named as a structured organization, Cosa Nostra, and hundreds of bosses received life sentences. But Riina did not forgive. In 1992, he struck back with bombs. Judges Falcone and Borsellino were assassinated in two separate attacks, just months apart. Highways were blown apart, entire streets turned to rubble. Italy was stunned. These killings marked the darkest point in the Mafia's war against the state. Yet the violence backfired. Millions of Italians took to the streets demanding change. The government launched Operation Clean Hands and special anti-mafia units. In 1993, Riina himself was arrested, ending his bloody reign. The Mafia was weakened, but not destroyed. It had survived for over a century, and even in defeat, it was ready to adapt. By the 2000s, the Sicilian Mafia was no longer the untouchable empire it had once been. With the fall of Toto Riina and his successors, the age of terror gave way to survival. Cosa Nostra remained alive, but it was scarred and fragmented. Many bosses were captured, betrayed by modern surveillance, wiretaps, and the bravery of informants who once would have died in silence. While weakened, the Mafia never disappeared. Instead, it adapted. No longer ruling through public massacres, it returned to its roots: silence, infiltration, and corruption. Its members blended back into business and politics, laundering money through construction, waste management, and international finance. Other groups, like the 'Ndrangheta in Calabria and the Camorra in Naples, even surpassed Cosa Nostra in power, dominating the global cocaine trade. The Italian state remains vigilant. Successive operations have dismantled clans, seized billions in assets, and arrested fugitive bosses hiding for decades. In 2023, even Matteo Messina Denaro, the last great fugitive of Cosa Nostra, was finally captured after 30 years on the run. His arrest symbolized the closing of an era. Yet experts warn, the Mafia thrives not only with guns, but with silence, fear, and complicity. Today the Mafia is quieter, but it remains. It hides in contracts, construction bids, and global markets. It is no longer the honor society of myth, but a criminal machine that has learned to survive across centuries. From the lemon groves of 19th century Sicily to the streets of modern Europe, the Mafia's story is a warning. Power built on fear never truly vanishes. It only changes shape,